In 1832 a painter vomited when he saw a 14-year-old girl hanging 8 feet off the floor, not from ropes, but from her own braided hair. He published a tame sketch. He hid the rest for 40 years. What they did to her scalp before the hanging explains why her skull didn't explode, and the reason will change how you think about ritual, biology, and power. Stay with me, we uncover the medical truth, why women begged for this, and the single group still hiding a version of it today. In 1832, American painter George Catlin walked into a lodge and saw something he never expected to draw. A girl, only 14, suspended 8 feet in the air. No ropes. No chains. Her hair braided into thick cords, tied to wooden hooks above. He left the scene sickened. He published a polite, censored sketch. What he kept in private journals for 40 years reads like an eyewitness report from another world. This isn't a sensational anecdote. It was a ritual with rules, timing, roles. Catlin recorded the timing down to the minute, 6 hours, 43 minutes. He watched the way the first hour numbness spread through her hands, how her voice frayed into silence by hour 2, and how, at hour 5, her eyes rolled back and she spoke a strange language no one else in the lodge understood. The tribe called her Red Flower afterward. She did not leave as the same person. Most of us assume this was punishment. I did, at first. But when you pull the field reports together across continents, a different pattern emerges. This was often elevation, not retribution. In societies where women had few formal paths to authority, endurance became currency. The woman who outlasted the others earned names, medicines, seats at council fires. The one who failed lived with that stigma forever. Now, the detail that made doctors and anthropologists stop and look harder was not the hanging itself but what came before it, deliberate, repeated injury to the scalp. In Mandan accounts Catlin saw, elder women shaved a 3-inch circle at the crown, then scored the skin with sharpened bone in a crosshatch. It wasn't random cruelty. Modern forensic study of preserved ritual sites reveals the scarification caused the scalp to heal with much denser collagen and deeper follicle anchoring. In plain terms, the very tissue that holds hair becomes reinforced, like rewiring a weak wall into load-bearing stone. Over months and years the scar tissue thickened. When the hair was braided into rawhide reinforced cords, those anchor points could bear weight far beyond what a casual observer would imagine. Biology, not magic, explains why skulls didn't shatter. But that clinical explanation is only half the story. What follows next, the extreme suspensions in the Amazon and the trance states of Siberia, shows how pain, physiology, and social power braided together into something both awe-inspiring and terrifying. If the Mandan ritual was considered controlled and even restrained, what happened farther south stripped away any illusion of gentleness. Because here, suspension wasn't just about endurance, it was about crossing a line most humans never approach. In 1923, Soviet ethnographer Valdemar Bogaris traveled to the Siberian Arctic to document the Chukchi people. His official reports were dry. His classified notes were not. What he witnessed, and what stayed locked in Soviet archives until 1991, were voluntary hair suspension rituals designed to induce visions. Not initiation. Not punishment. Purposeful neurological disruption. Women volunteered knowing exactly what it would cost them. Bogaris recorded that suspension affected the brain in 2 devastating ways at once. First came the pain, enough to trigger an endorphin surge comparable to a clinical dose of morphine. Then came something stranger. The suspension angle altered blood flow, restricting oxygen in some regions of the brain while increasing pressure in others. No drugs. No plans. Just the body pushed beyond its normal regulatory limits. The result was a real, measurable altered state of consciousness. One woman, Kna, hung for 3 full days. 72 hours. The tribe lowered her every 6 hours for exactly 12 minutes, just enough time to restore circulation, then raised her again. During those days she spoke continuously. She described caribou migrations weeks before they happened. She warned of a coastal storm that drowned 3 hunters who ignored her. She named pregnancies before women felt the first symptoms. Bogaris tried to explain it away. Coincidence. Pattern seeking. Collective belief. Until he watched prediction after prediction land with unnerving precision. But here's the part the Soviet authorities refused to publish. 2 years later, Bogaris examined Kna again. The visions hadn't stopped, but neither had the damage. She drifted between waking life and dream states. Conversations froze mid-sentence. She described seeing figures that others couldn't. Bogaris documented what modern neurologists now believe was hypoxic brain injury, permanent changes caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation. They paid for prophecy with her sanity. And yet women continued to volunteer. Because in Chukchi society, a woman who could see beyond outranked chiefs and warriors alike. She was untouchable. Sacred. Essential. Pain wasn't a side effect of power. It was the mechanism. But one culture took this logic further than any other, not through visions or spirits, but through a hierarchy so brutal it structured an entire society from childhood to death. And that brings us to the Yanomami, where suspension didn't test endurance. It assigned your worth for life. In the Amazon rainforest, among isolated Yanomami groups near the Venezuelan border, pain wasn't a gateway to mystery or prophecy. It was administrative. A brutal sorting mechanism that decided who would eat first, speak first, and matter first. When Brazil's federal indigenous agency FUNAI made first contact with one such group in 1967, researchers didn't just document rituals, they documented a social hierarchy built entirely on pain tolerance. And at the center of it was the weight-bearing hair suspension ceremony. Preparation began months before the ritual itself. Unlike the Mandan, who reinforced the scalp, the Yanomami reinforced mass. Tribal women wove additional human hair, cut from elders and relatives, into the girls' existing braids. Not for beauty. For physics. More hair meant greater surface area. More braiding meant the force of weight spread across thousands of anchors instead of hundreds. By the time ritual day arrived, the braids reached nearly to the ankles. Girls around the age of 13 gathered in a ceremonial clearing. Their hair was fixed to a horizontal wooden frame, something closer to a gallows turned sideways. Then the stones began to appear. One every 15 minutes. Quietly. Methodically. This wasn't chaotic suffering. It was measured. The rules were simple. Endure the longest, rise the highest. Fail early, and you carried that mark forever. The girl who lasted the longest gained first-tier status, preferential food access, leadership eligibility, desirable marriage prospects. The girl who broke first was labeled nar, weak, and relegated to the margins of tribal life. FUNAI researcher Paula Sula documented one ceremony involving 17 girls. The weights began at 5 pounds. They didn't stop until some exceeded 40. The test lasted 9 hours. The first girl collapsed at hour 2. Her jaw dislocated from clenching. Others followed. At hour 8, one girl remained. Her scalp had begun separating from her skull. Blood ran down her neck. Witnesses reported she screamed only one phrase, again and again, "No more. I am here." Her name was Teneri. She endured 9 hours with 43 pounds of stone pulling her backward by the hair. At 18 she became a tribal leader. For 32 years she directed hunts, negotiated alliances, and arranged marriages. Her authority came from one day of agony. But not every girl survived. Sula's report references at least 3 deaths over 2 decades, skull fractures, hemorrhage, spinal trauma. This wasn't symbolic suffering. It was lethal selection. And yet the ritual stopped, not because the tribe abandoned it, but because the modern world stumbled across a version that hadn't disappeared at all. A version hiding in plain sight. Not in the jungle. But in a place millions of tourists visit every year. Myanmar. 2003. UN human rights investigators arrived to examine rumors surrounding the so-called giraffe women, Kayan women famous for wearing stacked brass rings that give the illusion of elongated necks. Tourists photograph them daily. Travel agencies sell the experience as ancient beauty. What investigators found didn't match the brochures. Those rings don't appear all at once. A full set can weigh more than 25 pounds. Worn without preparation, the pressure is unbearable, collarbones compress, ribs deform, nerves scream. Most people would remove them within days. So the girls were trained. A whistleblower from inside the Kayan community, her identity still protected, revealed the preparation ritual. It began at age 5. First came scalp conditioning nearly identical to Mandan scarification, shaving, scoring, controlled healing. The goal wasn't decoration. It was tissue reinforcement. By age 7, the girls were suspended by their hair for the first time, 15 minutes. The next week, 30. Then longer. By age 10, some endured 3-hour sessions. This wasn't about the neck. It was about teaching the nervous system that extreme discomfort was survivable. Normal. Expected. By the time the brass rings were fitted, the girls were neurologically conditioned to endure pain without panic. Those who hadn't undergone suspension were more likely to remove the rings, which meant loss of income, status, and visibility. For families dependent on tourism money, That wasn't an option. The UN report recommended immediate intervention. Thai and Myanmar authorities acted quietly but forcefully. Villages were monitored. Tour companies were warned. The ritual went underground. And that's where the real damage began. Historically, hair suspension was overseen by elder women with decades of experience, women who knew exactly how long was safe, when to stop, which herbs prevented infection, which signs meant permanent injury was approaching. In secrecy, those safeguards vanished. Between 2004 and 2006, 3 girls were hospitalized. 1 suffered permanent nerve damage. Desperation led to shortcuts, younger ages, longer suspensions, less preparation. By 2015, regional NGOs reported the practice had nearly vanished. The last known practitioner, an elder woman named Muchi, died in 2019 at the age of 94. When she died, the knowledge went with her: scarification patterns, timing protocols, herbal treatments, all erased. The ritual didn't disappear because communities decided it was wrong. It disappeared because it was exposed. And that leaves a question investigators never answered: whether stopping it protected girls, or erased one of the only paths to power women had ever built for themselves. One final piece remains: the suppressed evidence. The reason anthropologists buried this history for decades. That's where we end. When anthropologists began to pull these rituals into a single frame, a pattern emerged that made institutions deeply uncomfortable. Hair suspension wasn't an anomaly. It was a system, one that appeared independently across 4 continents, spanning nearly 5,000 years. And in 1947, the American Anthropological Association made a quiet decision. Certain expedition reports were reclassified as culturally sensitive. Photographs vanished from archives. Field notes were sealed. One researcher saw his career collapse after refusing to stop documenting what he'd found. Officially, it was about ethics. Unofficially, it was about control. Because the evidence complicated everything modern anthropology wanted to say about women and power. These rituals didn't fit the narrative of passive victims. Again and again, the documentation showed women volunteering, requesting it, competing for it. Pain wasn't imposed, it was chosen, because it produced status men couldn't biologically access in the same way. Across studies, scholars estimate between 50,000 and 100,000 women underwent some form of ritual hair suspension. Some for initiation. Some for prophecy. Some for rank. The outcome was consistent: suffering converted into authority. And that idea, that extreme embodied endurance could function as a ladder to power, was dangerous. Not sensational. Subversive. Eventually, the rituals faded. Some collapsed under external pressure. Others dissolved as elders died and transmission chains broke. But the impulse behind them never disappeared. You can see it today. Modern suspension performance art, bodies hanging from hooks pierced through skin, traces a direct lineage to these practices. Ultra-endurance athletes push pain until cognition cracks and altered states appear. Body modification communities deliberately scar tissue to demonstrate resilience, identity, control. The method changed. The belief didn't. That enduring pain gives you something others don't have. So here's the question I want you to actually sit with, not hypothetically, not bravely, but honestly. If you were standing in that lodge right now, hair braided tight, feet about to leave the ground, could you last 60 seconds? Not because you had to, but because it meant status, voice, power. Drop your answer in the comments. And one last thing. I almost didn't publish this, because next week's investigation goes further than most people are comfortable with. A ritual that involved voluntary amputation for spiritual authority. Fingers. Toes. In 3 documented cases, entire hands. If you want to see it, you know what to do. Subscribe. Hit the bell. These videos get buried for a reason. I'll see you in the next one, if you can handle it.